Okay, ay kimmatos na ispumukna, kimmukna. Ay kimmatos na ispumukna. Lydia, kimmukna. Ay kimmatos na ispumukna. Kimmatos na ispumukna abstitoki na natosi. Ay kimmatos na ispumukna na kaya. Hayo kimmatos na ispumukna na mitsukunana. Hayo kimmatos na ispumukna abstitoki. Kimmukna na abstitoki. Hayo kimmatos na ispumukna na mitsukunana. Hayo kimmatos na kipataki. Kimmukna kipataki. Hayo kimmatos na ispumukna na. Cover.
My name is Lydia Schultz Silva. I'm from the Blackfeet Nation. With this film, I hope that Native people begin to understand or become interested to learn how historical trauma has impacted their lives and the lives of their families intergenerationally. Some of the social problems that Natives suffer can be traced to historical trauma. There needs to be an acknowledgement of our history, our present, and our future. You can't heal what you don't acknowledge. Jan La Van Zandt. This presentation is entitled Magapi, Historical Trauma Perceptions from Diverse Cultures. I chose the title because in Blackfeet language, there is no translation for trauma. According to Louise Jackson Braverock, a blood elder, and Virgil Braverock, the closest translation for trauma is Magapi, which translates to bad or bad times. According to Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, historical trauma is defined as a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma experiences. Other terms that should be defined are historical trauma response and historical unresolved grief. Braveheart explains historical trauma response as the grouping of behaviors in response to this trauma. Some of these behaviors include self-destructive behavior, suicidal thoughts and gestures, depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, anger, and difficulty recognizing and expressing emotion. Braveheart said historical unresolved grief is associated with historical trauma response and may be considered impaired of cumulative lifetime stress.
When I first began reading the works of Maria Braveheart and others, I was both devastated and I was relieved to learn our history. Historical trauma has affected my family intergenerationally. We've experienced many of those things that you read or hear about in stories from others. There's things like poverty, forced fee patents, which of course includes loss of land, racism, shorter life expectancy, boarding schools, suicide, alcoholism. In fact, as Blackfeet people, there's things that stand out in my mind which are certainly not the least of a whole. In 1883 and 84, there was a starvation winter where 6,000 of our people died, which was almost 2/3 of our entire tribe. I think of the loss of land in Glacier National Park. After the starvation winter, White Calf, who was our chief at that time, had sold Glacier National Park, and that's a whole story in itself, to the United States government, and they had agreed to pay for it over a 10-year period. You'd have to go back to DC and beg for the money. In fact, he died there asking for payment. And I want to be careful to mention the attempted destruction of Indian families, whether it's a boarding school or foster care. I'm a third-generation boarding school person. My grandmother and mother were also a part of boarding schools. I was in 3 different boarding schools. We don't talk much about foster care, and it's still a part of what goes on today. In 1978, 2/3 of all Native children were in out-of-home placement. 35 to 40% of the kids are still in foster care. The last statistics that I had heard.
I'm a descendant of an internee in a prisoner of war camp during 1943. And that was my mother, my aunts and uncles, and my grandparents. Our parents and aunts and uncles never talked about going to the internment camps. These were gulags. These were prisoner of war camps. The plans of the government could have included mass extermination. It was times of war. These families didn't know what they were going into. And men lost their jobs, their businesses, their homes. This left the mothers to try to hold the families together. The backbone of the Japanese American family, which is the family unit, like one of the main events for the family is to have dinner together. Well, in the camps, they had institutional child rearing. The children would just rove around the camp for whole days. The discipline or the family bond was dissolved, and the families fell apart. And where it comes into intergenerational trauma is that there's these sleeper effects. So these children who grew up in the camps, they grew up to become parents. Since they were raised institutionally, they didn't really know what it meant to be parents or to have parents. They had said that, the camps were bad enough, but what happened after the camps was worse than what happened during the camps. And what happened after the camps is they came back to the towns that they left, and they had no homes, they had no communities, no jobs were available. They had terrible racism, they were beaten, raped, places set on fire, but no one ever talked about it. They're loyal American citizens. Even to bring up a memory of it would re-traumatize them. And that's why we need to learn about this history in terms of not only myself, but as Americans, American citizens. And this is where I saw linkages with Native Americans, because Native Americans really, there's centuries of genocide, prejudice that have gone on, and but it's been going on for such a long time, it gets lost in the sands of time. It can have a sleeper effect. So, people on the outside, they have these problems, alcoholism, domestic violence, and it comes from going back to when these people were children, and they were victims of, they grew up around alcoholism or substance abuse or domestic violence because their parents had been traumatized. We need to remember our history, so these things that have happened to our grandparents, to our parents, and to ourselves through intergenerational trauma are not forgotten. These things that happened in history, so they won't happen again. And that's in terms of like civil liberties.
My name is Dan Press. I'm an attorney in Washington, D.C. I've spent the last 45 years representing tribes and tribal organizations, and more recently I became an adjunct professor at Columbia University, where I'm teaching courses on tribal government and also teaching courses on Indian education. And in both of those courses, the consensus of the students over the past couple of semesters is that the best explanation for some of the dysfunctionality you see in tribal governments, the high dropout rate you see in reservation high schools, the differential between reservation students' performance on math and English tests versus non-Indians, all of those can best be explained by historical trauma. And this past summer, a group of Columbia students put together a program they called Alternative Education, in which they developed a curriculum that talks about the genocide that's the cause of historical trauma, and then Native American resilience and resistance to that trauma, that they presented to high school students on 5 reservations during a week-long summer program. It was very well received. It's clear the high school students were eager to have a forum in which to talk about genocide, something they know about but is never talked about in the high schools.
So their intrusion on our culture, they've taken many things from our people. When I talk about Holocaust and all that, they envision these prison camps and stripes. I mean, it is embedded in us. But when you look about Holocaust, look what happened to our people. Look what happened to Wounded Knee. When our elders in those years of the Sioux had given up their weapons and moved into this camp in the middle of the wintertime, thinking that they were promised this was a safe ground. And the 7th Cavalry came in and wiped them out, elders and children and youth. They killed them. And they had the audacity, these white people, to broadcast it on pictures, standing there looking at this big mass grave and burying our people. It's showing these Indian corpses frozen on the ground. Do people think of that? Compared to the Holocaust, which happened a world away, and it's written in the front back door, it happened here among our people. How they had distributed blankets to our elders that were infected with smallpox. We went through a form of segregation as the black man did in this country. We went through it. My dad has pictures back home that showed that Indians couldn't go into public parks. They had to get permits to leave the reservation to go to the stores and go buy groceries for the children off the reservation. They were given time. There were notes on public parks that said Indian can't drink here. Does that get announced? No. They put it to another culture. They forget about our people. So when you talk about, when this talks about historical trauma, so they need to know, yeah, they need to know that happened to us.
We must be vigilant of the effects of historical trauma in order to recognize it and prevent it from happening. Dr. Joseph Stone, who is Blackfeet, a clinical psychologist and a chief of behavioral health services at Gallup Indian Medical Center in Gallup, New Mexico, made this comment. I don't get the luxury of standing here talking about this stuff as though it's a theory. It's my story. It's good to know the story. It's good to know we can change it. The presenters expressed exactly what Dr. Stone stated. It's their story. It's our story for those of us suffering from historical trauma. The content of what Dan Press and his Columbia students are teaching Native students is resilience. They are taught how tribal governments work and how important it is to continue with their education. These examples are important because resilience isn't just about surviving. It's about making a good life and a quality of life. Education is imperative to improve Native lives. Virgil Brayrock emphasized that our Native children need to learn about their history in the schools. Part of institutional racism is the lack of a Native American curriculum. Native Americans are non-existent in the instruction of American history and invisible. Healing from historical trauma is going to take all of us working together, from teachers to tribal leaders, medical doctors, and anyone who works with Native people should have an awareness of the effects historical trauma has on Native people. Similarities for diverse cultures who experience historical trauma may result in oppression, racism, lateral oppression, denial, clinical depression, and suicide. And the major difference is how each culture copes with the effects of historical trauma. Further research and dialogue is warranted in the area of historical trauma. Let me leave you with this as food for thought. No one is ever a victim. Although your conquerors would have you believe in your own victimhood, how else could they conquer you? Barbara Marciniak. Thank you.
When you're going to take make a vow to take anything like that, a medicine pipe, you've got to get an older person to offer prayers. So we went down and I told old street cat to come up that evening. That we had some very important business that we wanted to talk with him. So we went to town that day and we got meat and different things in a blanket. So he came up and I cooked supper for him. And the old man told him. We always had a pipe, you know, like these. So he filled that pipe towards evening. We all went out. All the four corners he stood. Made that offering that was going to get one of those medicine pipes. And just getting near 4th of July. Of course, it's these Indian days, but it was the 4th of July. Somebody made a medicine launch that summer, I don't remember who it was. He says, when we move in there, then you can go around. Well, we had just about 2 more days to move home, you know. So I told the old man.
During the 4th of July?
Yeah, after the 4th.
Yeah,
we was in an encampment up here.
Uh-huh.
I told the old man we've got just 2 days to be here, and old street cap hasn't made that medicine brush